afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jillian Dunks. I'm an archivist in McMaster Library's Department of Archives and Research Collections, and today I will be moderating this session. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the operation of all wonderful things, magic and the occult at McMaster University Library. During our time together today, we will be examining some of the rare and unique occult books held by the library. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the original and ongoing inhabitants of this land, the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations, on whose territories I, as a Hamilton resident and McMaster employee, now live. This land is protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, and allied nations to peaceably care for and share the resources around the Great Lakes. Hamilton is also covered by the Between the Lakes Treaty No. 3 of 1792. This is a treaty between the Anishinaabe-Moan-speaking Mississauga people and the Crown. As a settler, it is imperative that I learn more about the history of the region in which I live, in the spirit of honoring the Indigenous peoples whose land this is and working towards a more just future. I encourage those of you joining us today to look at the online map my colleague Bridget Whittle will post in the chat. This map will help you identify whose traditional territories you are on. Please feel free to post whose land you are on in the chat. So today you are joining us for a partnership event between McMaster alumni and the Department of Archives and Research Collections. This event is part of the Archives Alive series, which introduces members of the public to the unique holdings of our department. A reminder for today to please submit any questions you have in the chat, which will be monitored by my colleague Bridget. Lastly, it is my very great pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, Myron Groover. Myron is Archives and Rare Books Librarian at McMaster University, where he also serves as a lecturer in the Department of History. After reading history at the University of Aberdeen, he completed his graduate studies in archives and librarianship at the University of British Columbia. His work currently focuses on collection development, advocacy, outreach, and teaching in archives and book history. Myron, a very warm welcome. I'm so looking forward to this talk.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Jillian. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen with everyone because I do have some slides for you today. I am really pleased that you can be here with me today. It is very nearly Halloween, and it seems like a good time to discuss one of my favorite areas of the collection, viz. The occult. So today we're going to begin with a very brief, possibly criminally brief discussion of Western esotericism before moving on to explore what I think we're all here for, which is some of the actual occult related books that are in our own collection in a little bit more detail. So perhaps it's prudent to start with a somewhat innocuous question, which is, what is Western occultism? What is this so-called Western esoteric tradition? Now, this is the subject of a voluminous scholarly and practical literature, which I couldn't hope to distill or even do justice here, but it does seem reasonable to posit that there are several contributing themes we can reliably identify as constituents of this tradition. If we start with the etymological premise that esoteric really just means specialized and occult just means hidden, we're left with the sense of a culturally and linguistically bounded set of specialized practices which are not to be shared too widely for achieving, let's say, practical goals, whether those goals are metaphysical or material or a bit of both. There's a huge amount of contention about whether the ends of the occult endeavor are manifested internally or externally, or whether this definition is so capacious that it enfolds even mundane activities. Aleister Crowley once famously described a spell of writing a letter that involved a series of ritual steps. First, I pick up my magic pen, and then I write on a piece of paper, and then I take it to a mystic known as the postman or something like that. But these kind of contentions and dichotomies are not necessarily reflected in some of the constituent streams of thought which contribute to the tradition. So maybe we can start by looking at some of those. As anyone looking at this list is likely to grasp, what I'm referring to as the Western esoteric tradition is really a confluence of traditions, practices, and literatures that vary widely in terms of their cultural context, geography, language, their attitude, and their purpose. I've tried to pick out a few of the threads of this tapestry, for brief and certainly inadequate exegesis here. But it's also important to note that these concepts were perhaps in conversation for long periods of time, but in terms of a Western esoteric tradition, they really began to coalesce in a more systematic fashion during the late medieval and early modern period. So what we regard as the Western esoteric tradition cohered, insofar as it cohered at all, comparatively late, partly because the material and intellectual conditions for that to happen were also coming together around the same time, perhaps the 13th to 16th centuries, let's say. Among the foremost of these is the tradition of Hermeticism. So Hermeticism is a wisdom tradition that originated in the Greek cultural milieu during late antiquity, and it's attested by an extraordinarily broad and heterogeneous literature in multiple languages. Hermeticism is concerned with a kind of interconnectedness between macrocosmic and microcosmic forces, which carries with it the idea that by exploiting correspondence between real-world objects or phenomena, we can influence or induce a sympathetic connection with powerful cosmic forces or principles by a process of association. The progenitor of this tradition is said to be Hermes Trismegistos, or the thrice great Hermes, a sort of a syncresis of the Egyptian deity Thoth and the Greek god Hermes, who arose during the Ptolemaic period in Egypt. To this day, a purported connection to ancient Egypt is like it's the nec plus ultra of credibility claims in Western occultism. The Egyptians were famous to all their neighbors for magical aptitude, so claiming a connection to Egypt, which in this case is actually not entirely spurious, though it is at a great deal of remove from the present moment. Claiming the connection with Egypt is a way of burnishing a supposed hidden lineage of transmission and authority. Egypt is so associated with practical occultism that the name Chem, which means the Black Land in ancient Egyptian, actually became the basis via Arabic of our words for chemistry and alchemy. Alchemy in Arabic is really, it's the science of the Black Land. That's what it means. The tradition of Neoplatonism was also part of this great proliferation of kind of late Hellenic philosophical traditions. It was characterized by a sort of a mystical monism that posits no ultimate distinction between material phenomena and the divine realm. Again, this is a highly compelling idea, the idea of manipulating the world around you and thus being engaged in an act of deliberate co-creation with the divine. So if Platonism is saying there are ideals in an ideal realm, Neoplatonism might say, what if there's only one ideal in the ideal realm and everything is a reflection of it? There was also an enormous tradition of both practical practical magic and classical translation in the Arabic cultural and linguistic sphere. From the Arabs, Western esotericism took geomancy, alchemy, an enormous number of transmissions and translations of classical era works, which were neglected in the Latin West from late antiquity right through to the medieval period. I mentioned before that we got our words for chemistry and alchemy from the Arabs, who are also justly famed for scientific learning during this medieval period. This points to the fact that it took a surprisingly long time for science and magic to disentangle from one another, which dynamic is a little redolent of Clarke's first law that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. It's also impossible to overstate the influence of Jewish thought on Western esotericism. The Hebrew tradition was regarded by early modern occultists as a bedrock of philosophical thought, in no small part because of its extremely close and deeply personal association with God and the origins of the world. And a key concept in Jewish mysticism is the idea that Hebrew itself is a divine language, and that the Hebrew language contains within its alphabet and grammar and within the language itself innumerable secrets of the universe. So these textual and numerological traditions get borrowed from very heavily by Western occultists. You'll find Hebrew names and concepts scattered throughout the corpus of contemporary occultism, perhaps nowhere more obviously than the enduring association of the Kabbalah with occultism. Kabbalah in the Jewish context is an extraordinarily rich and sophisticated philosophical mystical tradition from which Western occultism borrowed a seminal text called the Sefer Yetzirah, which describes the process of divine will perpetually becoming manifest in the world through the metaphor of the tree of life, a sort of series of stages of expansion, contraction, and distillation by which divine energy travels from the divine to the material realm. But working with and between these forces, which are the trunk and branches of this tree of life, has become a central motif of contemporary occultism. And last but by no means least, Christianity itself is the perpetual mirror which reflects the Western occult tradition, really from the early medieval period onwards. Even esoteric practices which did not take pains to assert their Christian legitimacy were consumed by their relationality to religious thought. What all these traditions have in common is the concept of sympathy or association, the idea that cosmic forces are attuned to mundane forces, and that the traffic between the mundane and the divine, or the mundane and the magical, is two-way. So bear that in mind as we explore some of these texts. We'll set the mood by beginning with some popular occult literature, mostly from the 18th century. What sets these sorts of books apart is that they were explicitly not occult, actually. They weren't hidden. They were not aimed at either occult practitioners on the one hand or learned audiences seeking to study the history of occultism on the other. There are two major themes which characterize this type of literature. The first being kind of a debate as to whether the supernatural is real or not. So you'll see various pamphlets and small books shooting back and forth, arguing about whether ghosts are real and whatnot. Sometimes these get really personal, and then that's really entertaining. It'll be like a refutation of the pamphlet of Mr. Burton, the idiot who asserted erroneously that ghosts are, I mean, it's really funny. The second theme is pure entertainment. These books were kind of like tabloids or even the horror movies of the day. So they're filled with ostensibly true stories of being visited by one's dead grandmother, or by ghosts appearing in the parlor, or famous hauntings of eminent houses or hovels, objects moving about spookily of their own volition, things of that nature. They contain a lot of accounts of witchcraft and of witch trials, and the more gruesome, the better. Atavism is really not a modern phenomenon at all. The first work we're going to look at in a little more detail is a very recently acquired, recently, let's say, cataloged copy of William Salmon's Medicina Practica. This actually came to my attention a few years ago, thanks to one of our wonderful students who was doing a bit of work with some older donations and brought this book excitedly to my desk because it looked cool and alchemical. I picked it up and I was like, and how? It's a wonderful book because it was written by an extremely odd person at an extremely interesting time. It's small, it looks a little dull and dreary, it's clearly lived a hard life, the paper's not in very good shape. It's a sort of extremely eclectic miscellany of pseudo-alchemy and pop medicine by a fellow who was notorious for selling kind of patent medicines and books about miracle cures that the medical establishment don't want you to know about. Learned opinion on Salmon is a bit back and forth. You know, was he an eclectic weirdo with a gift for self-promotion who was trying to democratize the practice of medicine? Or was he like a totally unscrupulous huckster dedicated to making a quick buck at the expense of vulnerable and poorly informed commoners? I must say, you know, my kind of consideration of that question has definitely shifted a little bit over the last 2 years. But regardless, you know, whatever our judgment, the book contains a lot of interesting material and had an outrageously ambitious premise, as revealed by its full title, which is Medicina Practica, or Practical Physics, showing the method of curing the most usual diseases happening to human bodies, as all sorts of aches and pains, apoplexies, agues, bleeding, fluxes, gripings, wind, shortness of breath, diseases of the breast and lungs, abortion, want of appetite, loss of the use of limbs, colic or bellyache, appositions, thrushes, quinsys, deafness, buboes, cachexia, stone in the reins, and stone in the bladder, with the preparation of the Praecipiolum, or universal medicine of Paracelsus, to which is added the philosophic works of Hermes Trismegistus, Calipersicus, Geber Arabs, Artesius Longueus, Nicholas Flamel, Roger Bacon, and George Ripley, all translated out of the best Latin editions into English. Before we move on, I want to draw attention to two particular features of this text. At the left, we see an illustration of what is described as Geber's furnace, which is a distillation apparatus ascribed to a gentleman named Abu Musa Jabir ibn Hayyan, usually known as Geber in the West, who was one of the foremost Arab polymaths and chemists of the Islamic Golden Age, someone who's active during the 800s. So even here in the 1690s, we're still recognizing that our traditions of chemistry and practical physics are derived from the medical expertise of the Arabs. And we also have here on the right an errata page, which is a feature of early modern printing whereby a printer would acknowledge typesetting errors in a finished work that were too late to correct. It's like, I'm not going to go back and reset the entire edition. Here's a page just saying this should say that. I always get a kick out of seeing those. Now we move on to a considerably less whimsical book, which was acquired just this year. This is the title page from the 9th edition of a very influential book called the Disquisitionum Magicare Libri Sex, which we might render as kind of like magical investigations or inquiries into magic. This is a stereotypically occult looking book. It has clasps on the binding, when in fact it's almost an anti-occult work. Because you see, this is actually sort of a witch hunting manual. It was prepared by a priest who originally trained as a lawyer and represents a sort of a legal weaponization of the famous Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, a very famous and influential kind of anti-witchcraft text. This work contains an immense amount of textual exegesis. So going back and really analyzing what scripture and the ancients had to say about witchcraft and the occult and what we would consider today to be the supernatural. And in fact, it was so scholarly in nature that was turned around against the book as a criticism. People are like, well, we're here to torture vulnerable people and get back at our neighbors. We don't want to hear what some ancient nerd thought about familiar spirits. In fact, it's actually now generally believed that Martin Del Rio, the author, never presided at and perhaps never even witnessed a real witchcraft trial. But in spite of this work went through numerous editions. This is the 9th, right? So 9 in less than a century. And it was extremely popular as a reference work. Here we're looking on the left at the censor's approbation from this book. This is a sort of a legal license from the church and the secular authorities to print and disseminate a work. Now, this edition was published long after the introduction of the so-called Pauline Index, better known as the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, or the Index of Banned Books, which originated in the mid-16th century. But even before the church developed a formal framework for proscribing literature during the Counter-Reformation, printers were still obliged to seek local political license in order to disseminate books through official channels. This system of privileges was what eventually evolved for good or ill into contemporary copyright. It has to be said, this is an extraordinarily unpleasant work. It begins speaking of the difficult necessity of these treatises, which really testifies to the almost unbelievably reactionary religious attitudes of the time. The 16th century was the time of the Protestant Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the Council of Trent, and the 30 Years' War followed closely on its heels in the early 17th century. So while there was a lot of burgeoning intellectual attainment in this time period, there was also an extraordinary amount of violence, intercommunity conflict, and very widely shared contempt for human life. Significant swathes of the European continent became effectively depopulated during the 17th century, during the more brutal of the wars of religion. So this work needs to be kind of read in the context of the cultural milieu of its time. But now we'll move on and talk about the things that we're all here for, which are the real occult books from our collection. And we're going to start with a very small book called La Véritable Magie Noire. And we can see here that this book is given an imprint of having been printed at Che Garcia in Rome in 1750. Even a novice student of typography looking at this title page would tell you that this is not 18th century typography at all. This must be a 19th century work. So this is a kind of a false imprint here. And this was a sort of a late example of a trend in French book manufacture called the Bibliothèque Bleue, which is kind of analogous to the chapbook phenomenon in English literature. Printing small, cheap, easily portable works on subjects of wide public fascination. And so this work is sort of in that vein. It's quite small, it has quite a flimsy binding. It was published clearly in the early to mid-19th century, and it is a pocket grimoire. It's a distillation of one of the most famous and most influential of the late medieval grimoires, the so-called Greater Key of Solomon. It's a distillation of this text into modern French. It's said to have been written by King Solomon himself, although really we think the grimoire was probably composed in the 1300s or 1400s. And this particular recapitulation started appearing in the 18th century, attributed to a mage pseudonymously named as Eero Grego, but no idea who this is. The great thing about this book is not just that it is a recapitulation of the Greater Key of Solomon, one of the most famous grimoires. It's not just that it's portable and designed to be carried around. The great thing about this particular book and this particular artifact that makes it unique is that it is very heavily annotated by a contemporary occult practitioner. So there are lots and lots of annotations, amendments, even corrections in the text, particularly involving comparison to the English translation promulgated by MacGregor Mathers in 1889. It's been translated several times since then, but Mathers's text was the kind of definitive edition for students working in English for a long period of time. And it begins with a wonderful section on kind of the preparatory work involved in magic, the consecration and dedication of magical instruments. So the wands and the swords and the pentacle and the cup, the kind of stock and trade of the ceremonial magician. How do you get these things? How do you obtain a wand? How is it made magically powerful? So here we have a series of rituals and symbols for consecrating and creating these tools, including sort of wonderful prayers and exhortations. So from the section on consecrating a sword, we see this conjuration: Je te conjure, épée, par ces trois saints noms, Albro, Abracadabra, Jéhovah, afin que dans chaque œuvre magique, tu me sois une forteresse et défense contre tous les ennemis visibles et invisibles, par le nom Sansadé, qui est très puissant, et par ses autres noms, Kados, 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 Adonai, Bloé, Hot, Ô Emmanuel, première et très nouveau, sagesse, chemin, vie, vertu, chef, bouche, parole, splendeur, lumière, soleil, fontaine, gloire, montagne, vigne, porte, pierre, bâton, prêtre, immortel, messie, épée, que tu présides en toutes mes affaires et en celles qui me sont contraires. Amen. Wonderful invocation there. Those of you who just turned into frogs, I apologize. And then we move on and talk about the bulk of the text, which is a series of astrologically themed pentacles. Pentacles are sort of magical seals or symbols which are held by their very existence and portability to effect changes or influences in the outside world, particularly conferring advantage over demons and spirits with which a magician might like to interact. And the book contains most or all of the pentacles of the Greater Key of Solomon. But the interesting thing about these pentacles is that they disagree wildly from version to version. Translations into different languages will number the pentacles differently. They'll be designed differently. They might look very, very different from each other. They might get reversed around. And indeed, some of the annotations in this text are just such corrections. Like Mathers says, this is pentacle 5, or, such and such a pentacle was actually already on page 200. You accidentally reused the same woodcut, which I kind of get a kick out of. And so these proceed through a series of planetary associations, beginning with Saturn and its pentacles, moving on to the pentacles of Jupiter. These are the pentacles of Mars. I'll draw your attention in particular to the image at the lower right. On the left of this 2-page spread, you'll see this kind of fantastically bizarre looking creature that looks like it has a beard and a lot of enthusiasm. Self-portrait anyway, and some kind of weird arms or whatever. When I first saw this, I hadn't looked at the Greater Key of Solomon in a while. I was like, what is that even supposed to be? So I compared it to kind of like a more authoritative modern edition. It's a scorpion. And in more modern editions, the scorpion is like anatomically correct and really great. And this scorpion in this pentacle just looks like the artist was having an incredibly bad day and was goofing around. So I really get a kick out of that. At top left, you can actually see a correction. You see a tiny, what looks like what we'd refer to in English as a Star of David with Hebrew letters in it and actually Hebrew names if you look really, really closely. This is actually an annotation saying such and such a pentacle is completely wrong. This is the actual right pentacle. Like, I don't even know what's going to happen to me if I use this pentacle that's in this text. So this is someone who's really got a practical interest in the occult. Then we move on and we look at the pentacles of the sun. In the lower right-hand corner, the leftmost of those four images depicts sort of God himself, again, in this text done in kind of a very cartoonish style. So these are the sun's pentacles, and we see at the top right image several additions from the annotator of this text, who is saying, look, you've actually gotten the inscription wrong, or you've omitted something from the outside of the pentacle, and you've omitted some of its content as well. Presumably, if you're a ceremonial magician trying to command or control demons, you don't want to make errors in your pentacles, so getting it right is really, really important. We also have these beautiful pentacles of the moon, which are a little bit different in appearance from all of the other pentacles in the text. And lastly, we have the pentacles of Venus, and then the pentacles of Mercury. This is an interesting work. The text in many ways is actually better than the early translations into English. It's more comprehensive. It contains more of the original text. The pentagrams or the pentacles themselves, however, are quite crude and poorly done. And they appear to have been engraved by someone who does not actually have Hebrew themselves. So it's difficult to see what they're even trying to say much of the time. So here are some of the annotations from this work. He says of the seventh pentacle of the sun that this is the sixth pentacle of the moon in Westcott, and the 8 points are rather different. Somewhat peevishly, of the sixth lunar pentacle, the commenter says this is evidently wrong. It's the same as page 102. This definition is given as the fifth of Saturn in Westcott. And then in another one, he actually completely corrects it and says this is all wrong. The names of the angels should be, and then he does a long list of Hebrew names that have been omitted from the text. So he's not very pleased with some of the, he or she, I should say, is not very pleased with some of the errors that are occurring in this text. And now we're going to move on and speak about my favorite. I'm biased, but my favorite of the texts that we're going to talk about today. It's my favorite for a number of reasons, not least that it's enormously influential to this day. This text is still one of the kind of bedrock sources for Western occultism in the contemporary milieu. This is also a very recent acquisition. This is something that we acquired actually earlier this year. And we were able to acquire this from a Canadian bookseller, all the better. And what we are looking at here is a first edition of the complete 3 volumes printed together of Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. So if we have any occultists in the audience, this is doubtless a name you've heard of and a text that you've heard of. It is impossible to overstate the influence of this particular volume. It is a fairly standard quarto-ish sized book. The binding, I don't think it's the original binding, but it is roughly contemporary. I have a binding of paneled leather on it. It was published in 1533, we think, and we'll discuss that more in a moment. And it is a comprehensive synthesis and summary of occult knowledge at this kind of turning point of the early modern to modern period. So Agrippa was active in the early 16th century. I can't emphasize the influence of this book enough. This is a masterpiece, or apparently, as I've put it here, a smasterpiece of early modern occult thought. It's actually first attested in 1509 or 10. He dedicates a copy to a friend and benefactor of his, Johannes Tritemius, who was a bishop of Sponheim. So he gives this bishop an early copy of the work, and this published copy diverges hugely from the original version, which means that he's been diligently amending and revising this text for a period of almost 20 years by the time that it's finally published. And the reason that one of the reasons this book is so significant is, remember that I said this kind of Western esoteric tradition really begins to coalesce during the early modern period, owing to a number of kind of societal forces that are all coming together at the same time in the Latin West. And this book takes place exactly at almost the high point of that phenomenon. It begins with an approbation. Remember, we discussed these before. On the right, we see the approbation of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. This is an extremely unusual page, although it doesn't look like it. This is a book which was ostensibly published in Germany in the Latin language for a Latin reading audience. Why is the dedication, why is the approbation in French to Charles V? This has led some to speculate that perhaps this was published in Basel or somewhere, slightly more within the orbit of the Francophone cultural sphere. I don't have an answer. I merely pointed out as a curiosity of the text. And we also see a dedication or a prefatory epistle to Hermann von Wied, who is a clergyman to whom this work is kind of being prefaced by letters saying, oh, reverend and most illustrated abbot or bishop, I present this humble and groveling work to you. I'm sure it's totally insufficient. There's kind of a formula of these documents which preface a lot of early modern books. And then we start getting into the good stuff. The heart of the first of the three books is a series of tables of correspondence. Now, remember, I've said a few times, this kind of principle of association or correspondence is a huge theme in Western occultism. The idea that, like, okay, the color blue corresponds to the planet of such and such, which is under the government of such and such a celestial intelligence and is looked after by such and such an angel. It's antagonized by such and such a demon. And by sort of relating those things to one another symbologically, a practitioner can construct a ritual apparatus or a theurgic or a thaumaturgic apparatus for effecting change in the inner or outer world. And so this book is a really valuable source of these kinds of tables of correspondence. It also has a fantastic section on one of my very favorite components of early modern and medieval occult practice, which is the art of geomancy, divination by earth, if you will. Geomancy is an example of a base 2 divinatory system. Base 2 divinatory systems are found throughout the world. Probably the most famous would be the I Ching, which has a series of trigrams formed by, again, binary values, either broken or unbroken lines, which can combine into a total of 64 hexagrams. The system of geomancy is much more finite. It only has 4 binary points, which means that there are a total of 16 possible figures here. And geomancy is an incredible synthesis of kind of intuitive and intellectual magical practice. It originates in actually in the Arabic magical milieu as the ilm al-raml, which is like the science of the sand or the science of the dunes in a certain way. The idea is that a practitioner is literally making a random number of dots, sometimes in a specially prepared tray of earth or just in the sand or the earth. You make a random number of dots, you make another random number of dots, you do that 4 times in line, one on top of the other. Then you count backwards to see if your random number was odd or even, and that tells you whether you assign 2 points or 1 point to that line of the figure. And in so doing, you end up with one of these 16 figures, which has a kind of occult significance and divinatory significance. Then a kind of mathematical calculation enters in where you usually generate what are called 4 mothers. So you have a question and you generate 4 primary figures. And on those, you perform a series of basically arithmetic calculations to derive subsidiary figures called the nieces and the witnesses and judges, whatnot, that give a whole lot more context to the question you're asking. And then these are sometimes superimposed onto an astrological house chart to draw that in. The reason I'm spending so long talking about geomancy isn't just that I love it, and I think that it's extremely interesting. It's because while astrology is incredibly popular today, geomancy has become almost totally forgotten in public imagination. And this is kind of interesting. We see here a line from Dante's Purgatory where Dante describes, the geomancer sees his greater fortune ascend undimmed up the east. So in this work, The Divine Comedy, which is a work of popular literature, Dante, in his time, is so conversant in this sign system and takes it so much for granted that others are conversant in it that he names one of the geomantic figures by name, expecting that a reader will know what it means, what its symbolism is, what its astrological associations are, and so on, which is quite interesting. And I will also point out another interesting feature of this particular chart, which is if we look in the left 2 columns, we see the figures and their names. We will see about halfway down 2 figures next to each other, which are called acquisitio. They're both called acquisitio, which we could say means gain in Latin. The first one says gain comprehended internally. The second is gain comprehended externally. This is fascinating because this second figure is more traditionally referred to as amisio, loss. And the visual cue for students of geomancy for these 2 figures is that acquisitio represents an upright cup or an upright purse. And amisio represents an upside down purse with presumably money falling out of it. But here the names are a little bit different, which I find very, very, very interesting. From there, we move on to derive various geomantic figures or sigils, which can be used in other magical works. And we also have a series of occult anatomies, so kind of mapping the geography and the geometry of the human body to astrological correspondences, to elemental correspondences, ideas that, holding certain postures could convey occult results, not entirely unfamiliar to us probably. And so we have a series of these wonderful illustrations which kind of map occult cosmological phenomena on the human body and its posture. We also have several tables of planetary sigils, and this is a kind of an interesting way of generating an infinite number of occult systems based on a finite set of numbers within a grid. So you have a set of numbers or letters within a grid that are in a particular order that corresponds to a celestial force. And from those letters and the numbers associated with them, you can spell out words or names, again, within the context of a specific planet, to generate different sigils, which usually look like these kind of squiggly weird lines. Usually when you see one of these kind of squiggly weird lines in an occult text, that is where it's coming from. This book is also famous as a repository of occult notation, numerology, supposed Chaldean number systems, and obscurantist Hebrew number systems, and also for kind of occult alphabets to be used by practitioners in dedicating magical equipment or in writing magical texts or whatnot. Probably the keen-eyed among us will recognize that most of these, particularly in this leftmost photo, which is showing us two of these magical alphabets, some of us might recognize that these letters derive quite transparently from Hebrew. These are effectively kind of like variant crypto-Hebrew scripts for Western occult esoteric use. The book also contains talismans. This one is referred to as a sacred seal, more efficacious against any diseases of man or any griefs whatsoever, in whose foresight are the four squared names of God. And it goes on to describe exactly how this is to be made with a handy illustration in case you weren't following along with the text. And this is one of my favorite pages of the whole book because I saw it and I had a real aha moment. What he's referring to here are sigils that are generated nomically by combining letter forms of a given name in a given alphabet. So he shows an example on the left of a Hebrew sigil, an example in the middle of a Greek sigil, and on the right we see an example of a Latin sigil. And what we're looking at here is the name of the archangel Michael, kind of intuitively derived into a sigil in these three alphabets. And the reason this made me go, aha, is that there was an entire branch of early 20th century occult practice by an occultist named Anton Osman Spare that was exactly around this premise, a kind of intuitive generation of magical symbols using letter forms. The idea in his system being, I'm going to subliminalize a concept in my mind by taking something that makes sense and distilling it into a nonsensical glyph that can then work on my psyche at an intuitive level. What we're seeing is essentially a very early form of this same practice in 1533 in Agrippa. And then we see certain familiar motifs of sigils, which can be received by revelation only. And otherwise, the only way to get these sigils is to be gifted them by God or by divine revelation. The last text we're going to talk about is the Liber Visionum, or Book of Visions, which is, it's the book about which I know least. It is about the book about which I am least competent to speak, but it is certainly the most rare of the occult texts that we have in our position. As much as I love the Agrippa, and I think that it's wonderful, not just because Agrippa was also an archivist, and an archivist to royalty, no less. I love Agrippa, but it's a printed book, and it's not a very heavily annotated one, which means that it's a lot like a lot of other printed books of its same edition. Our copy of the Liber Visionum is a manuscript, which means that it's inherently unique. And not only is it inherently unique, it is one of only 6 attested fragmentary manuscripts of the work to which it attests that are known in the entire world. And I'm going to begin with a quote by the scholar Claire Fanger, who did some work with our text in the 2000s. where she essentially says, this appears to be a Marian, almost devotional work. But what this really is a recapitulation of, or at the very least, a work in conversation with the medieval demonological tradition of the Ars Notoria. So whereas the purpose of the Liber Visionum may be a synthesis with divine energies, it derives from magical systems which are really about communing with and commanding maleficent celestial energies. So kind of turning that on its head. The manuscript itself is comparatively late medieval. It is interesting because it's written on a mixture of both paper and vellum, which is, significant in and of itself. It was written by, who knows? I don't know who the scribe of our manuscript was, but the author of the text was one Jean de Morigny, often called John the Monk, who flourished in the late 1200s and early 1300s. And what this manuscript is a distillation of a work called The Flowers of Heavenly Teaching, first written in Orléans in the early 1300s. And as I said, this repurposes the Ars Notoria within a kind of Marian framework, and not just a Marian framework. This book could only have been written at this time because it is clearly tied to the burgeoning emergence of the formal university movement within Western Europe, because its core is a series of complex rituals, prayers, fasts, austerities to be undertaken with the explicit goal of academic excellence. The goal is the mastery of the 7 liberal arts, the quadrivium, and somewhat more controversially, there's the so-called acceptive or forbidden arts, hydromancy, necromancy, divination, etc., in addition to rhetorical excellence or perfect memory. So you could say that this is a very, very complex and counterintuitive method of cheating, or it's a significant devotional, occult, magical, religious exercise. It's kind of a bit of both, but I find that really, really interesting that it is so intimately contextualized within this kind of intellectual milieu of the late medieval university or very proto-early modern university. And I just wanted to close with some close-ups of this text because it's extraordinarily beautiful. It's filled with kind of allegorically illuminations here, in almost all of which we see the motif of the flaming dove. The flaming dove usually points to the manifestation of the Holy Spirit, or the kind of divine spark of inspiration and will in the world. And it's significant that in almost all of the illuminations, or many of the illuminations of this text, that the dove of the Holy Spirit appears, kind of analogous to what the magician is seeking to have happen to them by following these instructions. It's a very, very beautiful text. A rich allegorical, symbological language informs its illuminations, but this is my favorite page. And this is the slide I will probably close on. This is my favorite page of the text, because what we're seeing here is a map of the exact conceptual universe that I was just talking about. This is a map of the quadrivium, the 7 liberal arts, and under my caption, unfortunately, we see the septem artes exceptiones, or the 7 acceptive arts: pyromancy, aeromancy, hydromancy, geomancy, geonegia, necromancy, etc. So in addition to these very kind of lofty academic purposes, we also have kind of practical or occult sciences being reflected in this ostensibly semi-devotional work. And I'm done talking about text, and I'm going to emphasize just a couple of modern recantations of these works, or modern appearances of these works. This, of course, is from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. The 4th episode of the 4th season shows the mark of this ostensible demon. Clearly, this figure is derived from Goetic or Solomonic pentacles. The text itself, hilariously, is just a news story about a new bus lane being installed in Dublin. My Gaelic is now much decayed. I haven't looked at it in 20 years, but even I can tell that the first two words say, "There's a bus lane." So well done to the prop department on that one. Transitus frui, one of the occult alphabets I showed you on a slide a while ago, actually makes an appearance in a still image here from the Blair Witch Project. So we're still borrowing from these texts to kind of add flavor to our media today. And last but not by no means least, probably the contemporary resonance of all of this that I'm most jazzed about. I want to share with you some art done by a prize-winning, a very well-known Canadian author, who I'm fortunate enough to call a friend, who lives here in Hamilton, named Gary Barwin. And earlier this year, I was tweeting about having acquired the Agrippa and how excited I was about it. And I included an image of Agrippa's angelic or celestial script. And Gary, who's also a visual artist, who does a lot of art around typography and punctuation, he was inspired by this alphabet to create a series of artworks, which he's still working on. And I love this sequence because it almost shows these letters being born from darkness into light. And so this is a kind of local and very modern resonance of this text in our local community, inspiring an artist. And I'm very grateful to Gary for his permission to share these with you today. So these texts and these motifs are still influencing our media, they're influencing our imaginations, and for occult practitioners, they're still influencing what we do in the shadows, as it were. And I think I will leave it there. Here's John Evelyn in sunglasses, and at this point, I will thank you very much for your patience. I'm sorry to rush the content. I know we're about at time, but if anyone wants to stick around for 10 minutes or so of questions and discussion, I'd be very happy to engage in that. It would be great.
Thank you so much, Myron. This presentation was so wonderful. I learned a lot. And as someone who just watched the Blair Witch Project recently, I appreciate your gloss on that scene from the movie. That was awesome. So I think a number of people might have to take off, but we're going to stick around for another 10 minutes. If you have some questions, please do submit them in the Q&A function. But what I'm going to start with in terms of asking Myron questions is some of the pre-submitted questions from folks. So to begin, Myron, someone asked, will we be able to see these books in person, or will they be available to view in the library?
Extreme yes. Yes, we are proud to be open to the public at the William Reedy Division. We are proud to, I mean, our self-conception is that we look at, these are mere artifacts. Right? They're important, they're significant, they derive from great antiquity, but they're artifacts in most cases whose content has long since passed into the public domain. That means we are merely the guardians of their containers. The content belongs to humankind. So yes, these will be available for consultation in our reading room. Some of them are so recently acquired, they haven't been cataloged yet. But as we begin to walk back some of the restrictions that we have necessarily needed to follow to keep everyone healthy and safe during the pandemic, it's our hope that we are going to have a lot more openness available from next semester onward for people that want to come in and see these in person. So yes, and I would definitely invite anyone who's interested to come on in.
Great. The second question that was submitted is, what are your thoughts on the fourth book of occult philosophy attributed to Agrippa? Is it authentic or pseudepigraphical?
It's totally fake. There's no justification whatsoever for attributing that work to Agrippa, except that it was done when it was published. His own students at the time, one of his own students actually said, there's no way, there's no way my teacher wrote this. It's not his style. He didn't write like this. And, content-wise as well, the fourth volume really deals with a lot of matters relating to geomancy, right? My favorite subject, which seems a little odd because he's actually covered geomancy already in the first book. So why, if he's already done the synthesis in 3 volumes, is he then going back and kind of hyper-focusing on geomancy, which is beginning to be on the way out in the fourth volume? It doesn't make a lot of sense. That's not to say that the fourth book isn't valuable. It is. It contains a valuable kind of a valuable reproduction of Pietro di Urbano's famous text on Modo Judicandi Questiones, which is a medieval geomantic text. So it's valuable, but Agrippa definitely didn't write it. It's pseudepigraphical would be the nice way of putting it.
Okay, great. On to the third question. Why did so much occultism and these books spring up in the 15th and 16th centuries?
A lot of things were happening all at the same time. In my line of work, I'm inclined to point to the advent of the printing press and the advent of movable type in the mid 15th century is highly significant. Why you see a proliferation at this exact time. But this is also a time period when the apparatus of textual scholarship is really, really expansive, and at this point very well respected. A process that starts really in the 1200s and gathers a huge amount of steam in the 1300s. By 1500s, this tradition of scouring the classical corpus, even or indeed especially if it means borrowing from interstitial Hebrew or Arabic translations of the same. It's really well established at this time period. So you have a lot of things coming together: technology, textual scholarship. Some people point to the dislocation of Greek scholars after the fall of Constantinople in 1453 as one vector. Others point to the kind of Reconquista in Spain as a rather unpleasant point of conversion, really the last conversion between Jews, Muslims, and Christians on the Iberian Peninsula. So there are a lot of things that are happening around about the same time that lead to this. And I see someone in the chat has also mentioned increase in literacy. Yes, there's an increase in literacy at this time period, an increase in a kind of emergent middle class literacy as well. And while some of the works we looked at today, I mean, Agrippa's in Latin, it's significant that the Greater Key of Solomon we look at from the 18th century is not in Latin, it's in vernacular French. So this is also a time period when vernacular languages are being standardized and developing their own widely shared literatures and standard orthographies and things of that nature. So there's a lot happening all at once that leads to this kind of enormous flowering of occult thought and particularly synthesis during the early modern period.
Thank you. Another question: what are the main differences between the Western and Eastern esoteric traditions?
Oh, that's a really big question. It's a huge question, and it's one that I'm probably not qualified to speak to. So I'm going to do my best to put my foot in my mouth here. First of all, there's a tendency, kind of a snide tendency of writers on the so-called Western esoteric tradition to say, oh, well, you know, our tradition is more practical in nature. It's focused on achieving, you know, things in the real world. And in the East, you know, they meditate and they're focused inwardly or whatever. Hermeticism and Neoplatonism both would kind of refute that central premise right from the get-go. So that's a little bit problematic. If I can point to a really clear difference, there's a huge difference in how these techniques are institutionalized and transmitted between the Eastern kind of Hindu Buddhist cultural sphere and the Western kind of Latin Catholic sphere, right? These texts are called occult in the West for a reason, right? They're supposed to be hidden, they're highly specialized, they're often written in quite esoteric language, so that even if you read, particularly alchemical texts, even if you can read them, you have no idea what they're talking about unless you have specific knowledge. Whereas in the East, you know, esoteric practices are much more part of a kind of established socio-religious apparatus, which means that these techniques, particularly meditative and ecstatic techniques, can be taught in an institutional context that is widely respected and not held to be at odds with religion in a way that is absolutely not possible in the West. That should not be taken as an implication that esoteric practices were widely accessible to what we might think of as the laity in the East, right? Prior to the 20th century, and it's still even, you know, in many Buddhist circles, very controversial, the idea of, you know, who is actually initiated into meditative practices and tantric practices and whatnot is still very, very fraught. So I don't mean to give the impression that, you know, esoteric practices were part of a like kind of a shared cultural ferment that everyone was participating in, but there was much more institutional legitimacy for them in Eastern cultures. And I think, you know, frankly, they tend to be very, very sophisticated as a result. And they also draw on kind of a little bit less of a fragmentary tradition, I would say, in the East. So the differences are both religious, cultural, and institutional or structural. And I'll stop there before I say anything foolish. Very, very, very good question.
Now on to our last question. What was the influence of Aleister Crowley on the modern occult?
I guess I'd say that Crowley's influence was inestimable, but frequently invisible on contemporary occultism. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Aleister Crowley, he was a dude who was kind of in the general ferment of the kind of Golden Dawn era of very late Victorian kind of theosophical flavored or theosophical influenced occultism. He was involved in a lot of late 19th, early 20th century occultism. He was very, very influential. He was involved in textual scholarship. He collaborated with others on translating and promulgating ancient works. He started his own religion that he declared himself a prophet of. That religion still has adherents and practitioners. So there are many, many Thelemites in the world. So some people would have an almost religious devotion to Crowley and his legacy. But I think Crowley also had a big influence on the emergence of neo-paganism, which a lot of people kind of think of as a sort of a side stream of Western esotericism. But I think at a level of kind of popular cultural engagement, a lot of people come to occult practice through some of the new religious movements that coalesced in the 19th and 20th centuries around kind of vaguely pagan themes, particularly Wicca. I think you can see a really clear connection between, I mean, in Gardner's case, it was explicit. Gardner was explicitly influenced by Crowley. I think Buckland was as well. And so Crowley, and frankly, I think some of Crowley's less desirable personality traits have found their way into the substratum of the literature and practice of a number of neo-pagan traditions. I don't know that in my reading has been sufficiently interrogated, but that is something that I see. So his influence was huge. I mean, you know, how many occultists had a song written about them by Black Sabbath? Or maybe that was Ozzy's solo thing. Anyway, if you ask people, you know, like name one occultist, Crowley is very likely to be the one. The irony is that Crowley was completely corrosive to any organization that he became affiliated with for any length of time. He enjoyed humiliating people. He enjoyed being cruel to people. He enjoyed destroying people's lives. And all of the occult associations that he was involved with early in his career collapsed shortly after his involvement. So the fact that we don't have a Golden Dawn today, or like kind of a continuous tradition of transmission that's widely popular from the late 19th century, Crowley has a bit to do with that too. So like, it's not all a great legacy, but you can't understate his influence.
Thank you so much, Myron. That is all that we have time for today. So this talk was recorded. A link will be available for viewing in about a week. The alumni office will send you the link, and the video will also be available on McMaster University's UTV YouTube channel. You will see a survey pop up when the webinar ends. We are very appreciative of your feedback, so please do fill this out. And thanks very much once again to Myron, Bridget, the team at Alumni, and especially all of you for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.